So, with that said, I think we covered all the announcements and housekeeping. I'm going to introduce Debbie. Debbie Fandrei is the curator of the Raupp Museum in Buffalo Grove. She still remembers how excited she was to register to vote in high school, and she's still that excited to vote in an upcoming election where she will get to help choose the library board and the village board in Arlington Heights. Now, Debbie regularly conducts field trips for over 3,000 K through fifth graders every year, so she is very excited to talk to adults tonight. And we're very excited to have her. So I am going to go off screen and turn it over to you, Debbie.
Okay, I am so happy to be here with everybody today. You're going to see me just so you can put a face to the voice, but then I am going to darken my screen while I'm presenting just so you can concentrate on one picture and not many. So, sorry, hit the wrong thing. There we go. And we are here today to talk about ballots, babes, and beer. Illinois women win the vote. And the first picture you are seeing here is the first woman to vote in Illinois. And this is Ellen Martin from Lombard. And she actually voted along with 15 other prominent women in Lombard in 1891. And you'll think, wait, it wasn't legal for women to vote yet, because in the original Illinois Constitution, voting was limited to white men, which is absolutely true. But Ellen, who was a lawyer in Lombard, had looked at the Lombard village charter and realized that they were a home rule community, and there was no specification in the Lombard village charter about who could vote other than that it was a citizen. So she, who was a women's rights suffragist and activist, went to the polls in Lombard with 15 other prominent women and a gripsack with her law book in it. They declared they were willing, ready, and able to vote. When they were met with shock, she flipped out the law book and presented the applicable laws. And the three election judges, by reports in the newspaper, continued to be so shocked that one fell backwards into a barrel, the other one was struck stiff, and the third judge was struck speechless. But they allowed the women to vote, and the votes were immediately challenged. The votes actually stood as legal votes. Unfortunately, Lombard was so shaken up by the whole situation that they immediately voted to change their village charter so women could not vote in Lombard anymore. But Ellen Martin and friends were the first women to vote in Illinois, although people had been active in trying to win women's votes for long before 1891. And in fact, one of the impetuses of women getting the right to vote started in the Civil War. And in the Civil War, although people were not actively campaigning for women's suffrage during the course of the Civil War, the fact remains that many of the women during that time period, since 1 out of every 5 men in Illinois served in the war, which meant there was a huge gap where the women at home were learning both farm skills and management skills, and what they could do by themselves or together as a group, but also fundraising, organization, nursing. So a whole world of skills that they had not necessarily had to put into effect in any previous occasions. And the war ended and people came back, although truly a startling, an appalling number of people did not come back. And the women, even if they were not nursing and actively raising money for sick and wounded soldiers, still had these skills. The other thing that became an immediate issue was the rights that were going to be given or not given to all the formerly enslaved people who were now free. And so many states, Illinois included, were rewriting their constitution, and the talk in the air was, what exactly are the rights of a citizen, and who is going to be a citizen, and what kind of rights do they get? And what the women of Illinois realized at the time was they were asking for rights for the newly freed slaves that they did not have for themselves, including the right to vote. And so the first push for women getting the right to vote in Illinois was around the time of the 1870 Constitution. And they thought, now would be the time. We're rewriting it anyway. Let's just make universal suffrage so that everybody can vote. Here's a picture. The top part is Illinois' 1818 Constitution, where you can see that, let's see if I can circle it for you, all white male inhabitants are specified as the people who are able to vote. Unfortunately, the effort to get women the right to vote in the 1870s did not do very well. And so, who shall be a male citizen of the United States above the age of 21 were the people who could vote after the 1870 Constitution. This was disappointing on multiple different levels. First, because it wasn't going to happen after people had fought quite hard for it, but also because they knew that the work of writing a constitution and changing the laws and getting everything set had pretty much taken up so much brain space and so much energy that there was not going to be a chance to amend the Constitution and change that law for probably the next 10 to 20 years. However, that didn't mean that the suffragists, the people who were interested in women getting the right to vote, were going to stop. They shifted tactics. And the idea became then, if women can't have the right to vote for everything, how can we work around this? And in fact, are there some elections that are so much in women's sphere of influence, in women's work, in women's world, that we can argue that they should be able to vote in that? And in fact, they were successful in those arguments. And the first elections that women could vote in Illinois happened in 1891, when women were given the right to vote for any elections having to do with school boards. And this could be local school boards. This could also be boards of colleges. And this went all the way up to electing the board of regents of the University of Illinois. And women could vote in all of those elections. And in fact, they could run for office in all of those elections. So the first woman to be elected under these laws was named Lucy Flower, and she became the first female member of the Board of Trustees of the University of Illinois, and in fact did things not only for women's college, but in that election, she was one of the people who were instrumental in letting women get admitted to the U of I medical school. So even if you think partial suffrage wasn't enough, it did begin to change things. Another fun fact is that this happened under a governor whose own daughter later would become the very first female state senator elected in Illinois. So women could now vote in school board elections, and that seemed to not bother people too much because that was part of women's world, and that was something they were comfortable letting women have a say in. The question then became, are there any other issues that are maybe so important to women and the family that you could maybe think about letting women get part of the vote for that as well? And while some people didn't really think that that might be an issue, there is one woman who knew exactly what issue women should also be allowed to vote in, and that was Frances Willard. And Frances Willard was a really interesting person, and she went from pretty much being an academic to an activist. She from 1871 to 1873, she, after teaching in other various capacities, she was the first president of Evanston Women's College. And in 1873, Evanston Women's College became absorbed into Northwestern, and she was Northwestern University. So she became the first dean of women at Northwestern. Um, she also became uh, an academic person who had issues with the president of Northwestern. So after she quit because of academic and intellectual disagreements, she became very active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was getting going at the time, but Frances Willard both revolutionized and reorganized it and made it from an organization that just wanted people to not drink to an organization that was a political force to be reckoned with. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union was concerned with saloons and specifically concerned with also not just trying to convince people not to drink, but in voting towns dry. And their argument was that women should get the vote in all local option elections because whether or not saloons could operate in the town was critical for keeping a safe home and family. So you've got the option as they see it, vote wet for my sake, and you're supporting the brewer and the dissolution of the family, or vote dry for my sake. Shall the mothers and children be sacrificed to the financial greed of the liquor traffic? It is up to you, voter, to decide. And if you needed a little help deciding, they also had a theme song for the members, which was "The lips that touch liquor shall never touch mine." And temperance became an issue that many, many women could get behind. So the thing became something where you had temperance parades in local municipalities. This is a picture of the temperance parade in downtown Waukegan. And if you can see the banners on the floats on the carriages say beer or boys, which, so you were either choosing beer or you were choosing the health and safety and sanity of your sons. And it became a way to motivate women who might not have normally thought it was their role into becoming politically active and interested in voting. Frances Willard was extremely pro women getting the right to vote, at the very least in local option elections. She thought this issue was critical. And once more, you can see where people might begin to think of it like a slippery slope. If you can vote in school elections and now you can vote in local option elections, then maybe the next step would be all elections. And this got many, many people motivated. The membership of the Women's Christian Temperance Union exploded and it became a national organization, which was great in one way because it made people politically aware and aware of what rights they possessed and what they didn't, and active in trying to get more rights. However, this was also key in linking the idea in people's heads that women voting meant women voting towns dry. And so you might have thought, well, I wouldn't mind if women voted, but I still like beer and I'd like to be able to buy it at the saloon. And if they get the vote, I'm not going to be able to do that. And so it set up a conflict between the two sides. And this was a conflict that would go on for years. Frances Willard became popular, and like I said, the membership of the Women's Christian Temperance Union grew and grew. And in fact, she became one of the first women to speak in front of the Illinois General Assembly, and her whole mission was to convince the General Assembly to allow women to vote in local option elections so they could decide whether towns would be wet or dry. You're seeing the view of the General Assembly for where she would have been standing, and she was a great organizer and motivator. So when she went to speak, her followers from the Women's Christian Temperance Union were up in the balcony. And as she spoke, and to prove their point about all the support they had, her followers let loose petitions that they had gathered in a big roll. And so the petitions dropped, multiple petitions dropped from the balcony all the way to the floor of the General Assembly. They had gathered over 180,000 signatures trying to convince the General Assembly to let women vote. The General Assembly was very polite and complimented the energy and efficiency and voted no. And in fact, the Women's Christian Temperance Union would persevere and would go down to Springfield with each new administration. And in fact, they would go for Governor Cullum, who said no, and Governor Hamilton, and Governor Oglesby, and Governor Pfeiffer, and Governor Altgeld. You guys are seeing a pattern, right? And Governor Turner, and Governor Yates, and Governor Dineen. 8 governors and 33 years of no. And if you keep doing the same thing and getting the same result, it is time to change strategy. And in fact, by the 1900s, people were thinking that not only was it maybe time to change strategy as far as women getting the right to vote, but it was time to change some things in politics in general. Because one of the things that's very hard for us to remember now is at this time, politics was a little bit different in that the senators from each state were actually elected by the state legislators. So the joke was that if you bought a state legislator, you actually got a vote for senator as well. So for the corruption business, it was 2 for the price of 1. This is a political cartoon of the bosses of the Senate, and you can see the teeny tiny senators and the great big steel trust and copper trust and Standard Oil. People were looking for reform. This was the progressive era. So not only were we talking about women's suffrage, but we were talking about pure food and drug laws, antitrust laws, child labor laws, settlement houses like Hull House in Chicago, establishing a minimum wage, establishing workmen's compensation, and women's suffrage. Not only were these the political ideas that were in the air at the time, you now had not just Women's Christian Temperance Union meetings, but you had the growth of women's clubs. And this includes a picture in the top right there is a picture from the Highland Park Women's Club. But many women's clubs addressed a lot of the issues we just talked about. So there was room for arguing for pure milk. There was minimum wage. There were, interestingly enough, in Highland Park, the Women's Club funded the salary of the first female police officer in Highland Park. And one of the things they also worked on was voting, because what people began to realize was whatever other issue they were most interested in, voting was not just an abstract right, voting was a way to get things done. And it's kind of crystallized by this poster. Votes from others. Politics governs even the purity of the milk supply. It is not outside the home, but inside the baby. And so voting became more than just an abstract right. It became a means to an end. And since many people were interested in the ends of school reform, food reform, everything else, then suddenly voting didn't sound like such a strident and bizarre and um, excessive thing to do, but rather something they could totally handle. And you see other arguments as well. The one on the left, I can handle both, and she is holding both a ballot box and a baby cradle. And you also see the beginning of the argument that women are paying taxes. Women pay taxes, women obey the laws, they suffer from dirty streets, impure milk, adulterated food, bad conditions, smoke-laden air, and underpaid labor. Women clean the homes, let them help clean the city. And that, I think, really was one of the clever things that women struggling for the right to vote were doing. They were saying, they were leaning into the image of women as a little bit better, a little bit more pure, a little bit less corrupt, and saying, politics, yes, you talk about how politics is dirty. Give us a chance to help clean it up so that it's not just, it's dirty, you should stay home and not worry about it, but it's dirty, it is affecting us. It is not outside of our role, whether it is bad food or bad laws or discriminatory things. Let women get a vote so that they can help clean it up. But even with all the goodwill and the appetite for change floating around, the truth is, after 30 years and 8 governors, people still thought the direct result of women voting would be towns would get voted dry. And so you needed someone who was good at organizing people with these new attitudes and also good at publicity and making sure that women voting did not become just one issue or one issue that was the goal of wealthy city women, but the goal of women all over. And the right woman for the time in Illinois was Grace Wilbur Trout. And if you see the first picture you see here is her in her fancy clothes, and she was a married woman who lived in Oak Park, and she was very interested in political equity. So her first role was she joined the Chicago Political Equity League, and that had a lot of different issues, but it also especially was interested in women's suffrage. And so she began her work there. And as she rose through the ranks there from just a member to a member of the board to one of the driving forces of the Equity League, she also would look like this as well. This is her in her parade uniform marching for women getting the right to vote and quite literally carrying the flag for Illinois. But what she was perhaps most brilliant at, in my mind, was realizing that it had to be more than a group of people in Chicago. That if you were going to get laws passed to change things in Illinois, you had to make sure that all the women from all over the state were invested in getting the laws changed. So in 1910, she launched with the Chicago Political Equity League the first automobile suffrage speaking tour of Illinois. And she and 3 other women suffragettes went on a road tour, and they covered in 1 week so many towns, and it was a barnstorming suffrage tour. So they covered, I'm going to take a deep breath here, Evanston, Highland Park, Lake Forest, Waukegan, Grays Lake, McHenry, Woodstock, Marengo, Belvedere, Sycamore, DeKalb, Geneva, Elgin, Aurora, Naperville, and Wheaton. There were 4 women in the car, and they made arrangements with local committees. Oh, sorry. No, no, oh, no, 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 no. And there we go. I apologize for the technical difficulty. That was just a preview, but they would drive up in this open car to a prominent place downtown in each city that they were visiting. Oftentimes they chose to go right in front of the local train station when the commuter train would come in, and the women would stand up in the car and give pro-suffrage speeches. So one would talk about suffrage in general, one would talk about how it would affect working women, another would talk about suffrage and how it would affect international international and immigrant women. And the fourth would talk about the economic effects. And their plan was always to get attention and to get commitments from local politicians right there at the rally in front of everybody to say that if a suffrage law came up, they would support it. They were actually also brilliant at getting publicity, because the reason you see this picture and the reason that you see that they got some of the publicity and the turnout they did was that there was also a team of reporters from the Chicago Tribune following them on this trip. So there was somebody taking pictures. The reporters were sending back briefs from the field each day about the crowds that were meeting the women. And the suffrage tour was considered a resounding success and caused a lot of interest in the towns that they visited, caused a lot of political commitments in the towns that they visited, and began to get many more members interested in change. And so this happened in 1910, and it was so successful in Northern Illinois that they repeated it and did suffrage tours in Central and Southern Illinois as well. Now, I will say later, one of the reasons that they were able to get the Tribune reporters to follow them was not only because they were a great human interest story, but because the wife of the owner of the Tribune was interested in suffrage. And so she was instrumental in making sure that they got enough press coverage to make this happen. So this was still bringing more people to the cause. And it was a good start. But what Grace Wilbur Trout realized was, once again, you needed not only people who were interested, but you needed to be able to get something past the entire Illinois General Assembly if you were going to get women the right to vote. And she knew that there were still pretty much four camps of politicians: the ones who were absolutely for it, the ones that were absolutely against it, and then the maybes. And all of the maybes had to do with how that politician felt about liquor and the thought that women might vote towns dry. And so they divided them up into the maybes who thought, well, I don't drink myself, but I need to make sure that the town is allowed to serve liquor because we have business people, it brings in tax money. And the other maybes who were, I do drink myself and I don't want to lose that ability. But they divided up the whole map of Illinois to establish suffrage clubs in every single county and to get a file on all the politicians in the General Assembly. And they decided to concentrate their lobbying on what they felt were the swing votes. They knew some people would never go for it, but they decided to concentrate on the votes they thought they could turn. Because at this time, although more people were still getting into it, it still seemed like liquor and beer were what people were worried about most when they talked about women's suffrage. And there was opposition. Vote no on women's suffrage. The ballot will secure a woman no right that she needs and does not possess. And there was an Illinois Anti-Suffrage Association, and that was their argument. Their argument specifically was, it's not women's place. They're busy with too many other things, taking care of the home, taking care of the family. That's their job. They don't need the added stress of voting. They wouldn't be educated voters, so it wouldn't help. And that they have either fathers or sons or brothers who vote, and They are good with the idea that their husband is voting for them, so this is not a right they need. You see even more danger. Women's suffrage would double the irresponsible vote. It is a menace to the home, men's employment, and to all business. There's another poster that it says it would involve the disintegration of the family and communism throughout the country. And you just have the whole, I want to vote, but my wife won't let me, with the man doing the wash at home. People worried about women's roles. People worried about, some people truly didn't want it, didn't think it was something that would be of any benefit to them. But it remains the fact that liquor and beer were one of the deciding things in whether people seemed to be for women getting the right to vote or not. And this was to such an extent that it makes you perhaps wonder today, were saloons really that bad? Was the idea of needing to vote communities dry legit, or were people just worried about nothing? And one of the fun things we found was a 1900 study from University of Chicago where they went out to actually investigate this. They thought there's so much overblown rhetoric on each side. Let's actually go out into the community. It was from the School of Sociology, and see what we find and if what either side is saying is true. And so their study was in 1900, and it talked about one ward, and they did both city and suburban studying. And so in one ward in Chicago, they found that there were 163 saloons in the 17th ward, and that of those, there was absolutely drinking, but that at that time, 139 of the saloons also were a place to get newspapers. 111 of the saloons were also where you could get a free lunch. 44 had pool tables. In many cases, the saloons were the only place in the neighborhood that had an indoor flush toilet. And it was also usually a default unemployment office / job exchange for many of the local residents. Now, that isn't to say there wasn't vice, because they also estimated that at least 34% of the saloons had rooms for working girls. And so there were both pluses and minuses, but that the saloons provided a social outlet for a lot of neighborhoods in the city that people wouldn't have found anywhere else. And just a fun figure for, at this time, at least, there was such a thing as a free lunch. And they actually recorded what was involved in a free lunch in one of the saloons that they surveyed. So this was on every single day. The free lunch meant that the saloon went through 150 pounds of meat, 50 loaves of bread, 35 pounds of beans, 1.5 bushels of potatoes, 120 ears of corn, and $1.50 in vegetables, which at the prices of the day meant that the free lunch cost the saloon owner $30 to $40. And that would seem like a lot, and people wondered how that was affordable. It was because a lot of buying was done by bulk by breweries who owned the saloons and owned multiple of the saloons. And this was also one of the things too, is not only were there saloons, but one of the reasons that drinking went up was there was a change in the technology used to manufacture beer. So beer was manufactured more quickly and more cheaply and more safely than it had ever been before. So it was also far more affordable for people to drink. And given that we didn't have a whole lot of water cleaning and purity laws yet, beer made a fine option. So that was the city saloon, which is where a lot of the anti-saloon sentiment originally arose from. But U of Chicago sociologists went out into the suburbs too, and they painted a picture that was very different between city and suburban saloons and the ideas about drinking. And the suburban saloons, while there were certainly suburban saloons, what they found more out in the suburbs, and especially in the Lake County and Northern Cook County suburbs where we are now, was more beer gardens. And beer gardens were family oriented. They were outdoors. They often had music. They were a place for people to spend the day. And oftentimes they served as sort of ethnic gathering places as well. So there was not a lot of anti-saloon sentiment in many communities where the beer garden was the social outlet. So the idea that people would vote not to have a beer garden was ridiculous, or in fact would be an indication that they would want women not to vote if you're going to vote against them. Well, this was all sentiment floating around as well, but just like the women's suffrage movement needed Grace Wilbur Trout to organize them, the saloons needed a protector at this time too, and an organizer. And in that case, it was this man, and this is Anton Cermak, and he would later become mayor of Chicago. But at this time, he was a rising young politician who was getting his feet wet, figuring out how the machine of politics and the courts and the laws worked in several different ways. And so he had served first in the municipal court, and then he was a member of the Illinois House. Then he became a Chicago alderman, and then he left being an alderman to become bailiff of the municipal court. And at that time, he was also president of the United Association. And that was the United Association of Bar Owners and Saloon Keepers in Chicago. So he was one of the chief lobbyists and operators who was working against women getting the right to vote because they knew it was a direct threat to their business. Grace Wilbur Trout agreed when somebody asked her, will women vote towns dry? And she said specifically, I hope they do. But even if they don't, even if they did, that's still no reason to deny people the vote. And you had both sides of this argument working and in the air, and people thinking about it and organizing about it. And it all came to a head in Illinois in 1913 when we had a new governor elected named Edwin Dunn. And the Women's Suffrage Association knew he was pro women's suffrage. So he would be, if they could get a law passed through the General Assembly, he would be willing to sign it. They also knew that this new General Assembly that took office in 1913 was one of the most cosmopolitan and varied assemblies. And so it included Republicans, Democrats, progressives, and 3 communists. So there was a lot of political diversity, and they thought they'd been organizing enough and they could get things done. They had to wait for some arguments to stop, though, because the General Assembly went down to Springfield, and the first 6 weeks of the session were taken up by 2 issues only. The first issue was the infighting in order to choose a new Speaker of the House, who eventually was a young politician named William McKinley. And then the second issue was to choose a new Illinois state, a senator from the state of Illinois, remembering that the General Assembly got to choose them. And in fact, because the previous choice and election had been deemed to be so embarrassingly corrupt that that senator was recalled and they had to choose a new one. But after that 6 weeks was done, they were ready to do actual business. And Grace Wilbur Trout was ready as well. She knew that this was probably the best chance they were going to have. And so they arranged to have a suffrage bill introduced, and they asked Speaker McKinley if he would support it. And he agreed that he would. So they had to make sure the bill would get out of committee and be brought to the floor for a vote. And they did that. But each step of the way as they became more successful. And she actually had to go down to Springfield and stay in order to make sure that all of the machinery to get this happening was going on. They were being equally fought by the United Association and other groups of liquor lobbyists who were raising the truly legitimate point that if you vote towns dry, people were going to lose all the liquor tax, which was a huge source of revenue for a lot of towns because we didn't have income tax yet. So this was going to be a big thing. And so the politicians were getting quite literally competing editorials put on their desk every day by the different newspapers. Grace Wilbur Trout later recounted how she would go to friendly editors and get multiple editors to write editorials that she suggested to them, but she wanted to make sure they came from different newspapers around the state so that it didn't feel like anything was being planted. But they knew that they should have the votes. However, the political pressure was getting so intense that Speaker McKinley, who was a new young politician who did indeed believe in women's suffrage, but also wanted to have a political career after this, asked Grace Wilbur Trout if she could please prove that there really was the kind of suffrage vote and public sentiment for suffrage that she had been assuring him there was. And so she went back home and she put her organization into effect with perhaps the best phone tree ever. And Illinois suffrage advocates, so supporters of the cause, called Speaker McKinley's house and his office and his mother's house in Chicago, which is where he was, every 15 minutes for 48 hours in a row. They got calls from all 102 counties in the state and then some. And at the end of it, he was convinced that the sentiment was there and the votes were there. And so it was brought to a vote first in the Illinois Senate, where it passed 29-15, which was 3 votes more than they needed. And then in the House, where it passed 83-58, which was 6 votes more than they needed. So they won by a margin of 9 votes. Governor Dunn signed the law, and Illinois became the first state east of the Mississippi to let women vote in elections. It became the first state with a large city to let women vote in elections. It was pointed to as an example by all the states around us along the lines of, well, if Illinois can do it, we ought to be able to do it too. It also was a state where people watched to see if women would actually act on it, because, okay, you got the right to vote, what are you going to do with it? And so after the first presidential election, when women could vote in Illinois, when over 200,000 women in Chicago alone came out to vote for president, people began to take women's power more seriously. Presidential campaigns began to include policy planks about women in the campaign, and it became real. Now, on a local level, to finish the story off, when you have new laws letting women vote, just like Ellen Martin was a cool story to begin with as the first women who voted in Illinois, reporters also wanted to know the first woman who would legally vote under the new law. And who you are looking at right there is Clara Colby from Libertyville, who became one of the first women to vote, not just in Libertyville, but in the state, because Libertyville had an election and it was a referendum for the Libertyville Village Hall. And that was going to be the first election that women can vote in. So not only did she vote, later on, she offered to give other women a ride to the election polls. And the reporters were following people trying to get a story. And she went home, and her husband was home. And they took a picture of her husband doing laundry on the porch while Clara was out voting. Now, depending on who you were, this was either a sign of things to come or a sign of the end of the world. Many years later, the Libertyville newspapers went back to the Colby's children and asked them about that. And one of their sons said, well, you know, we can probably tell people now, but that would be the first, last, and only time my dad did laundry. And it was a setup for the news photograph. The reporter had followed mom home and said, wouldn't it be funny if? And Mr. Colby said, I think it would. And that was when the picture was taken. But this is the story of women getting the right to vote in Illinois. And thank you all for being here. And I am going to stop sharing screen and turn my picture back on. And I'd be happy to take questions or comments. And happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody.
Thank you very much, Debbie. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. I'm happy to give them to Debbie and see what we can answer. Nothing so far. I did promise earlier that I would give you my email address in the chat if you want to contact me about the digital preservation. So I did just put that in the chat. While Debbie was talking, I wanted to know, she was talking a lot about saloons, and I did go into our 1913 telephone book to find out how many saloons were in Libertyville at the time. In 1913, there were 5 saloons in Libertyville, with a population of about 2,500. Although there's 17 total saloons listed in the telephone book, but it covers an area from Round Lake to Lake Zurich and Prairie View and all of that. So, little background information.
I know in Buffalo Grove, we had a couple of beer gardens, so. Okay, well, thank you, and have fun, and please remember to vote when you can vote, because people made work to make it happen. So thank you, everybody. Have a really great evening, and enjoy the next talks coming up. They sound really interesting as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. Thanks everybody for attending, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.